My Best Friends Live in the Woods. The Adventures of Albert by Anne Michelle Mracek. Chapter 34. Congratulations! News spreads fast in the forest. Owl and Crow Teacher wasted no time in describing the promise and the engagement from last night's party. All the birds were a twitter, and every detail was told and retold from wing to wing. It wasn't long before Anne the Dove, or Shadowforce as she liked to be called, heard all about it. "How very sweet," she said to Mrs. Robin as they sat on a limb of the hackberry tree. "Yes, and wasn't it lovely of Benjamin to have a necklace for both mothers?" Mrs. Robin was truly impressed. "Bluebell deserves a kind and thoughtful boy," Shadowforce nodded in agreement. "Did I ever tell you about the 2 mice I gave a ride to?" Shadowforce asked. "Why, no! How extraordinary!" Mrs. Robin was a bit shocked. "Yes, it was a bit amazing," Shadowforce bobbed her head. "They made the cutest couple. I guess that's what brought them to mind. All this engagement news," she said. "Do you remember their names?" Mrs. Robin asked, becoming interested in the story. "Prinelopy and Chad. They were quite brave, and it was Prinelopy who gave me the name Shadowforce," she explained. "You don't say. The mice usually keep to themselves," Mrs. Robin said. "So true," Shadowforce agreed. "I wonder whatever happened to them," Shadowforce said, her mind reviewing the memory. "Well, I think you should go check on them." Mrs. Robin smiled. "Perhaps I will," Shadowforce agreed. "I wish these berries would ripen," Mrs. Robin said, changing the subject. "They're my very favorite," she smiled. "Fall is still a long way off," Shadowforce nodded. "Well, I'm off." Mrs. Robin smiled at her friend. "See you later," she called as she lifted off into the light blue sky. "I think I'll fly over to the strawberry patch," Shadowforce said to herself, as she too lifted off. "They should be right by now. Maybe the mice will return," she thought. It didn't take long until the dove was circling overhead, looking down at the strawberry patch. "I can't see them from up here," she thought, and floated down for landing. "Hello, Prinelopy? Chad? Anyone?" Shadowforce called out as she walked through the red berries. They did look wonderful, and she began pecking at one especially large red strawberry in front of her. She heard scurrying and turned around to see a small group of mice staring at her. "What do you want with Prinelopy and Chad?" one of the mice asked, annoyed. "Yeah, what could a dove want with those 2 dummies?" another mice in the group said, and they all laughed. "How dare you!" And the dove was angry. "Prinelopy and Chad are brave and amazing. I am Shadowforce, and I am pledged to fly Prinelopy and Chad whenever they need me," she said as she fluffed her feathers to look as large as possible. The group suddenly looked shocked and took several steps backwards. Wide-eyed, one of them said, "You are real?" "Of course I'm real, you idiot!" Shadowforce said loudly. "Now, where are my friends Prinelopy and Chad?" she demanded. The group of mice were looking at each other in stunned silence. They had all assumed that Prinelopy and Chad were lying when they talked about flying on the back of a great dove who took the name Shadowforce from Penelope's stories. Now, confronted face to face, They were in awe. "Are you all deaf and dumb?" Shadow Force said, losing her patience. As they stood staring, they heard Prinelopy and Chad call out from behind them. Everyone whirled around to see the two running up, all smiles. "Shadow Force, how wonderful to see you!" they called out as they raced up. The group of dumbstruck mice stepped to either side as Prinelopy and Chad ran through the center they had cleared. And the dove was thrilled to see them well and happy and cooed as the two mice stroked her feathers. "Jump on," and the dove said. "I'll take you for a ride. Shadow Force at your service," she said quite loudly so that all the other mice would hear. "There's news at Mother Skunk's. I'll tell you all about it as we fly," she offered. "Great," Chad said with gusto. "Then let's go to Mother Skunk's cave," Shadow Force said as Prinelopy and Chad took fistful of feathers perched confidently on their back. As she took to the sky, Prinelopy and Chad yelled, "Wahoo!" leaving the stunned gathering of mice far below in the strawberries. Finally, one of them found their voice. "Well, that changes everything," he said, and they all nodded. Meanwhile, at the cave, Bluebell was seated at the kitchen table, all her sisters gathered around. They were giggling and admiring her engagement necklace. "It's so beautiful," Rosie was saying. "However did he manage it?" Debbie was amazed. "I know! Isn't it wonderful?" Bluebell gushed, all smiles. "Do you have a wedding date?" Melanie wanted to know. "Oh, heavens, not yet," Bluebell laughed. "For sure, not until after the crowning," Mother Skunk interjected as she puttered around the kitchen, putting away the now empty cookie platters. Bluebell nodded in agreement. "I want to have plenty of time for a blessings party and to plan a huge wedding," Mother continued. Bluebell blushed. "You're my first, and it must be special," Mother smiled. "We will all help," her sister said with excitement. "It is thrilling," Bluebell said, truly enjoying the enthusiasm of her family. Then all heads turned to the sound of a loud peck at the window. As they looked, they were all shocked to see a dove on the sill with two mice sliding off her back and squeezing through the gap in the window frame. The mice were chattering excitedly when they suddenly looked up and saw all eyes staring at them. They were instantly silent, their whiskers twitching nervously. "Well, hello there!" Mother Skunk broke the silence as she opened the window. "And whom do I have the honor of meeting?" she asked the mice and the dove. And the dove was the first to answer. "Oh, cuckoo, I am Anne the dove, but I prefer to be called Shadow Force." Mother Skunk nodded. "And these are my friends, Prinelopy and Chad." Anne introduced the two nervous mice. Prinelopy did a little curtsy and elbowed Chad. "Oh, right," he whispered and did a tiny bow. Shadow Force continued. "Mrs. Robin said that Ruby Hummingbird said that Tidal the Sparrow said that Owl said that Bluebell was engaged and Albert was promised." "Yes, so we wanted to congratulate you," Prinelopy added, finding her courage. "Well, I'll be," Mother Skunk said to herself, amazed. All eyes were still staring on in silence at the windowsill. Chad smiled shyly and waved. "Hi," was all he could say. Bluebell stood up and walked toward the window. Her smile was kind, and she held out her arm. "Thank you ever so much," she smiled at the three. Would you like some gingerbread? We have several crumbs left in a bowl from last night. The thought of gingerbread was always a winner. Oh, yes, thank you so much, they all agreed happily. Climb on my arm and I'll take you over to the table, Bluebell smiled. Now, ordinarily, the mice would have scampered away in fright. But Bluebell's reputation was known forest-wide, and Prinelopy and Chad were no ordinary mice, so they climbed on and trusted Bluebell to carry them to the table. All the sisters were giggling and leaning down to see the tiny visitors more closely. As they hopped off Bluebell's arm onto the table, Mother Skunk brought over a small plate with several crumbs of gingerbread. You too! Mother Skunk waved over Shadow Force, and she flew over and landed next to the mice. So, it's true then? Shadow Force asked Bluebell, eyeing her necklace. Oh yes, quite true, Bluebell nodded. Your necklace is amazing, Prinelopy commented. You like that? Chad asked Prinelopy. Oh yes, it's amazing, she beamed. Then, when we get engaged, I'll ask Benjamin to help me get a tiny one for you, Chad said quite seriously. Prinelopy looked at Chad wide-eyed. What did you say? She said shocked. You heard me, Chad smiled, his eyes twinkling. Albert walked in to see all his sisters circled around the table, all bent over at the waist. From this vantage, it was quite funny, and he couldn't imagine who they were talking to. He tipped closer and peered over Abigail's shoulder. Imagine his surprise to see two tiny mice and a dove merrily talking to the encircled group. Penelope noticed him peering over. Congratulations! I heard you are promised, she called as loudly as she could, which wasn't very loud actually. Albert smiled broadly. Thank you! News spreads fast, he laughed. Bluebell nodded. Birds, she said, and Albert nodded in understanding. When all the cookie crumbs had been enjoyed, Shadow Force nodded toward Mother Skunk. We should be getting back, she cooed. Just wanted to share in the joy, she added. Well, it's a lovely surprise, Bluebell said as she carried the mice back to the windowsill. The window was still open from letting in Anne the dove, but the mice still scampered through the window frame crack out of habit. Penelope turned back to wave. Thanks again for the corn, she said and winked. Mother Skunk and Albert looked at each other and burst into laughter. That explains a lot, Mother laughed. After lunch, Bluebell took a stroll to see if Benjamin was home. She met up with him about halfway. He had been walking toward the cave. You're a magnet, he smiled. So are you, she agreed, and they laughed. You'll never believe who came to visit this morning, Bluebell said as they walked hand in hand toward the stream. We had a dove fly to the window with two tiny mice riding on her back. It was quite extraordinary. Bluebell retold the morning's events. You don't say. Benjamin was amazed. Mice usually keep to themselves, he commented. Not these two. They're named Penelope and Chad, and apparently they changed the dove's name from Anne to Shadow Force, Bluebell continued. How odd, Bluebell said, absently stroking her hand. Something about a dragon, Benjamin nodded. Anyway, they heard about our engagement and came to congratulate me, she smiled. Really? Benjamin was surprised. Birds, she said. Oh, he nodded. Chad wants your help to have a tiny engagement necklace made for Penelope, she continued. Benjamin frowned. I don't think I like that. Pretty soon, every girl in the forest will be wearing a mother of pearl necklace and yours won't be special anymore, he said, a bit angry. Oh, it's okay, Bluebell patted his hand. Mine will always be special. It was blessed by the stars, water, fire, and forest, and most importantly, it is from you, she said, smiling at him adoringly. Benjamin relaxed. You sure you don't mind? He asked. I'm sure. We are trendsetters, she teased. But come to think of it, how did you manage the necklace? She asked. Benjamin smiled. I heard you and Jillian talking about the button on Anthena's robe, and it gave me an idea. I went down to the Great Glen and asked Mother Dear about it. She had the button made by the royal sewers. When I explained my idea, she was excited to help and summoned them. He was proud of himself as he related his secret. So, Mother Dear knew about it all along? Bluebell asked. Benjamin nodded. At first, the royal sewers were not happy about the idea. They complained they were overworked with all the sewing for the crowning and such. So I offered to trade something for it. All the minks got in a circle and chatted among themselves. Then one of them stepped up and said that they would trade my babysitting for all the little minks while they sewed. Once the crowning garments were ready for the second fitting, they would carve the necklace for me. He smiled and sighed. You know, baby minks are a handful. If I had known how mischievous they were, you might not have gotten your necklace at all, he teased. Bluebell laughed. Well, I love it and I will wear it forever, she smiled. Speaking of crowning clothes, we should get that second fitting scheduled, she said seriously. Let's head over to the Great Glen and try to get it set up, Benjamin offered, and they changed their direction to head off toward the glen. How did you get the cords purple? Bluebell asked as they walked. I snuck back in and used the dye pot you set in the back room, he smiled. Back at the strawberry patch, the group of mice were once again harvesting the red berries to dry for the winter. A shadow moved across the path, and they all scurried for cover, thinking a hawk might be overhead. As they peeked out from their hiding places, they saw Shadow Force swooping in for a landing, Chad and Prinelopy yelling, Yippee! Ha ha! Their whiskers streaming back from their faces. As they slid off Shadow Force's back, the others came tiptoeing out to peek at them. Now, I'll be off, but remember, you can call on me anytime you need me, Shadow Force said quite loudly so all could hear, giving a little bow of her head. Treat these two with the greatest respect, or the force of the dragon will come down upon you, Shadow Force said to the circle of mice peering out in stunned silence. Then she winked at Chad and Prinelopy and took off. After another moment of stunned silence, one of the mice stepped out and did a little curtsy toward the two as they waved goodbye to their friend, the dove. Chad and Prinelopy turned around to see all the gathered mice, one by one, doing little bows and curtsies to them. Chad stood, reached out and took Prinelopy's hand and helped her up. They stood together and nodded to each mouse as they paid homage. Then one of the humbled mice asked Chad, Sir, where should we store these strawberries? Meanwhile, Benjamin and Bluebell had arrived at the Great Glen. They walked up to see Molly, Clara, and Jillian talking with Anthena. I think we should sing at least one or two, Jillian was saying. We could modify our morning sunrise song, she offered. Anthena looked up to see the two walking up. Hi there, she waved merrily. Bluebell waved. Are we interrupting? She asked. Oh, no, just more planning for the crowning, Anthena sighed. That's what we came for, Benjamin added as they joined the little group. We were hoping to schedule the second fitting for the ceremony clothes," he added. Owl waddled up. "Oh, yes, of course. Good idea, I must say," he hooted. Anthena smiled. "He always wants to be in charge," Anthena whispered to Jillian with a wink. "Oh, did you say something?" Owl hooted. "Oh, it's nothing." Anthena giggled. "Humph!" Owl sputtered. "The fitting?" Benjamin asked again. Owl motioned for Benjamin and Bluebell to follow him as he waddled across the glen toward the shade of the pine trees. "Congratulations on your impending nuptials," Owl said formally. Bluebell and Benjamin thanked him as they walked along. "Oh, sire, someone to see you," he said with a bow. The royal couple looked up from their lunch. "Oh, wonderful to see you," Mother Deer smiled. "Congratulations again," she beamed. "Thank you," Bluebell said with a little curtsy. "Come join us for a bite of lunch, won't you?" The stag smiled and motioned for them to come over. "Thank you," they both said as they sat down on the cool, tall grass. The shade was welcoming and the smell of pine overhead was lovely. As they munched on dried mushrooms and clover flowers, Bluebell explained their mission. "Yes, so glad you stopped by. We do need to get that scheduled," Mother Deer agreed. "Owl, fly over and see how soon the royal sewers will be ready for the second fitting," she instructed. "I think they are ready," Benjamin offered. "I traded babysitting for the necklaces," he said proudly. "Good for you." The great stag smiled at Benjamin, impressed. "Well done." Soon Owl swooped back and silently and carefully tiptoed around behind the group as they chattered. He stood right behind the stag and yelled in his loudest voice, "Hoo-hoo! They are ready any time, sir!" The stag almost spat out his mouthful with a start. "Don't do that," he laughed. Owl just bowed, but he was hiding a laugh as he looked down. "You were right," the stag said to Benjamin. "No point in waiting. Let's meet tomorrow morning before it gets hot," he suggested. They finished their lunch and headed back to the cave to tell Mother Skunk of the plan. As they passed by, they heard the trio rehearsing their song for the crowning. "They really do sound lovely," Bluebell commented. As they walked, everyone they met was eager to congratulate them. Tommy Red Fox scampered over to wave. He was singing "Tra-la-lee" when he saw the two walking past and stopped mid-chorus to rush over. "Congrats!" He smiled and waved. "Thanks!" Benjamin waved back. He continued his song as he trotted off. "Albert likes that song too." Bluebell smiled. Mrs. Rabbit, Gabby, and George were out with the water buckets again and were glad for rest. "Bluebell's getting married," Gabby sang in a tease, then blew her a kiss. "Congratulations," Mrs. Rabbit said excitedly as she hopped up to them. We need to plan a blessings party for you, my dear. I'll talk to your mother about it," she said, patting Bluebell on the hand. "Oh, thank you," Bluebell beamed. Mrs. Robin quickly stepped along the forest floor, then stopping in a freeze to listen for worms. As they walked up, "Wonderful news, you two! Congratulations!" She beamed at them as Tidal swooped in. "Happy long life to you," he chirped and flew off. "Thank you," they called after him. When they were almost back at the cave, Crow Teacher looked down to see them walking hand in hand. He flew down and perched on a low limb of an oak. "Castle, I wanted to congratulate you again," he said in his raspy voice. "I was wondering," he continued, Now, where do you plan to live? He looked back and forth. Between them. Bluebell was struck silent. She hadn't thought about that. She lived in the cave. But now what? As Crow Teacher flew off, she turned to Benjamin. Where will we live? She asked, worried. Oh, I thought we would float downstream and head out on our own to discover a new forest, he said, waving his hand. Bluebell took a step back in horror. I'm joking, he laughed. But I do have a plan I know you will like. He winked. They arrived at the cave and announced the second fitting for the crowning clothes was to be the next morning. Wonderful! Mother Skunk clapped. So, down to the stream with all of you after supper. It's bath night, she announced. Aw, not that, Charlie protested. Getting cleaned up isn't so bad, Albert smiled at his little brother. After all the baths were over and everyone was tucked into bed, Bluebell tipped out of the bedroom and sat by the fire next to Benjamin. So, where are we going to live? She asked, still quite concerned. Benjamin smiled. Remember I told you I snuck into the back room to use the purple carrot dye? He asked, and she nodded. Well, did you know it's not actually a room, but a passageway to many more rooms? He asked. No! Bluebell's eyes were wide. It's true, he insisted. I had time while the dye soaked in, so I lit a candle and went exploring. How about we move into our own extension of the cave? There are several places where you can see light coming through. I think we could even dig out a separate outside entrance. He was so proud of his discovery, he was beaming. Would you like that? He smiled. Bluebell threw her arms around his neck and kissed him. Yes, I would like that, she giggled enthusiastically. And so would I, Mother Skunk chimed in. She had been sitting at the kitchen table. Then it's settled, Benjamin smiled. We will start digging out an entrance right after the crowning ceremony. Congratulations, you two, Albert said as he trotted off to bed. Chapter 34. Congratulations. Discussion and questions. Community. Being part of a community is sharing news. It's natural for big events like engagements to be talked about and shared with the entire group. Everyone wants to share in the joy. This is completely different from gossip, which is often mean-spirited and hurtful. The forest community is truly happy and supportive. Question 1. Do you have a community or circle of friends with whom you share news and joy? Question 2. Is it important to be part of a supportive community? We see a complete transformation in how the mice community treat Chad and Prinelopy. The mice community accuse them of lying and ridicule them. After the encounter with Anne the Dove, or Shadow Force, they were respectful and impressed. The social status of Chad and Prinelopy was elevated to one of highest esteem. Question 3. Is there someone in your social group you look down upon? Question 4. Would knowing more about them give you a better understanding of their true worth? Bluebell's reputation for being kind allowed Chad and Prinelopy to trust her. Question 5. Do you have a reputation in your community for being kind? I am the composer and performer for all the music in this video. Both audio recordings and the printed scores are available on mybestfriendsliveinthe.woods.com. I will provide the link below. The painted illustrations are also my creation. Prints are available on mybestfriendsliveinthe.woods.com. This is a novel. The chapters are meant to be heard in the order in which they were written. And while each chapter can stand alone, They do build as new characters are introduced and past events are referred to. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. The chapters are numbered, so if you're just joining us, be sure to go back and watch from chapter 1.
In a dream, in a trance, my spirit flies to the pink horizon of a forest, where fairies say, "Come and play," and the animals say, "There's a better way," an enchanted land of love.